Hello, world history students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I've got your notes for Chapter 31, Section 3, Cold War Conflicts. We're going to talk a little bit about the Korean War. And before World War II, Korea actually was ruled as a colony by the Japanese. One thing that should be said is that, in the time leading up to World War II, Japan was looking for land to expand. It was kind of believed that they needed some growing room because they didn't have enough land on mainland Japan to kind of satisfy the needs of its population. And since Korea as a peninsula is literally right across the Sea of Japan, this seemed to be kind of the ideal place to expand. Many children who were raised in Japan during the 1920s and 30s, even during the war years of the early 40s, grew up learning Japanese culture, learning Japanese history, and such. So there's some kind of difficult issues between the Korean people and the Japanese people due to the way the Japanese treated the Koreans. And even to this day, there's a source of animosity between the two groups of people, which has kind of caused some constrained or strained relationships between South Korea and Japan today. But needless to say, in 1950, shortly after China became the People's Republic of China, we started seeing, kind of the rumblings of the possibility of war that was going to take place on this peninsula. After the war, the United States had occupied Korea south of the 38th parallel, while the communists eventually occupied the north. So to kind of illustrate that, I'm going to flip to a different map here. Starting kind of in the early part of June 1950, this is kind of what Korea looked like. If you were in the northern part of Korea, the part that's kind of shaded a little bit of pink, if you want to call it that, salmon, that would have been kind of the area that would have been a little more sympathetic to the Chinese communist government. South of that line where it says 38 degrees, that's your 38th parallel. That's an area that would have been at a point in time kind of sympathetic towards democracy, maybe a little bit more in tune with some of the policies that were being established by the United States within that neighborhood of Japan and such. So, June of 1950, the North Koreans actually crossed the 38th parallel into South Korea. And I'm going to flip the map here. And basically, there's a few phases of this war. If you take a look at the map that's on the far left, in June of 1950, the North Koreans literally are able to take over a good portion of South Korea, except for this little corner on the far southeast side of the peninsula near the city of Busan, and not very far from Japan, by all means. And because of that, and the fear that communism could be spreading not only to Korea, but eventually closer to Japan, this kind of resonated with members of the United Nations that something needed to be done. At that time, the United States was a member and still is. And we actually took the leadership to say, hey, we need to do something. And for the first time, the UN, which was really newly established, it had been um, basically something that had developed after World War II, uh, got a international coalition of countries together and sent troops to occupy or to regain South Korea. So, to the next little map here, the second map that you see is basically what was happening towards September through about maybe December of 1950. These coalition troops uh, basically invaded South Korea and they started marching north and pushing the communists further north. Um, the goal here, was to liberate South Korea. But the military, some of our leaders, particularly Douglas MacArthur, who was the man who was kind of put in charge of these troops that were in South Korea, wanted to go ahead and not only push the Chinese or push the North Koreans um, back into North Korea, but also to push the war further into China. By December of 1950, China sends troops and pushes US forces and UN forces south of the city of Seoul. And basically from 1951 to about 1953, when the armistice is signed, the Korean War really focuses around this area around the 38th parallel. There are going to be some days that the UN forces are able to take land from the North Koreans, and then the next week that land is regained by the North. And it just kind of goes back and forth like a yo yo. Anyway, by the summer of 1953, an armistice is agreed upon, and that is the what we call today the DMZ, the Demilitarized Zone, and that is still where it has been since 1953, right along the 38th parallel. So, and then in 1950, the armies of North Korea invaded South Korea. United Nations troops, led by General Douglas MacArthur, counterattacked, and we have this grind, this war of attrition that kind of goes back and forth from 1951 to 1953. In 1953, two sides sit down for peace talks, and they agreed to stop the fighting and divided Korea near the 30th parallel, which that is the point where it's still divided to this day. Anything north of that is North Korea, anything south is part of South Korea. The demilitarized zone is an area where U.S. troops have been stationed since really 1953, and it is one of those things that if you happen to go into the U.S. Army, that you might be deployed to serve along the DMZ. Thank you very much.